we saw a lot of families in the parks. The dads would be out with the children. The riverboat, we were docked by the river, and the dads would be out there fishing with the boys and things. We're just really family oriented, sort of, kind of maybe like this country might have been back in the 50s. I know it was like Britain used to be, you know, right after the war. Did somebody have a question?
Pat, the architecture in Moscow, just the city itself, the pictures that I've seen, what I remember from studying this in the past, you had your public buildings that were relatively ornate and so forth, the palaces, of course, and everything, but the rest of the buildings under communism were pretty utilitarian.
Well, that's pretty
I'm going to
much
let
what I'm
Carol.
going
Carol's
to.
going to talk about that,
Okay.
about the architecture in Moscow.
Okay.
But you're exactly right. Yeah, the older buildings are beautiful. And Moscow doesn't have a whole lot of them.
Right.
When we left Moscow, as I said, we went up the Moscow Canal, it was called. And we went through many locks, which was really interesting. I've got some photographs in the book of how they tied the boat to a hook. It's built into, it's like a track built into the wall of the lock. And they tie the boat on there, and it pulls the boat down as the water goes out of the lock. And then when you get to the other, you know, you get through and they get the water leveled off, the gate opens and you sail out the other end. But that was really interesting to me to watch how we just sort of plummeted all the way down.
Several times.
Well, all in all, I think we probably went through over 20 locks, but it took 6 to get from the Moscow Canal into the Volga River. And of course, you know, the Russians think a great deal about the Mother Volga. So, finally, we got to St. Petersburg. And I'm telling you, we have a saying in Scotland, when something is really amazing, we say we're gobsmacked. Well, I was gobsmacked by St. Petersburg. It is magnificent. But that city was demolished during World War II. What you see today is a complete restoration, and it looks just like it did back in the 1800s. It is magnificent. Leningrad, you know, it used to be St. Petersburg, then it was Petrograd, then it was Leningrad, and now it's St. Petersburg again. And they had a siege, the Germans besieged that city for 900 days, from 1941 through 1944. And they absolutely demolished it. And it is amazing. I've got, again, some photographs in there. We have books of the city. And it is just, you feel like you've stepped back in time. The buildings are truly magnificent. The Winter Palace, which is now is the Hermitage, you hear about it. It's a wonderful museum, but don't ever go to it during cruise ship season. We were on a small riverboat. We had 140 people on our ship. The day we were at the Hermitage, there were 7 cruise ships docked in St. Petersburg. It was a nightmare in that museum. It was just wall-to-wall people. You couldn't really enjoy the magnificence of the building itself or the artworks inside of it. So if any of you ever want to go to Russia, I would say make sure that you go outside of cruise ship season when you can actually get around and not be faced with thousands of tourists, not just hundreds, but thousands. I think they said there were 3,000 in the Hermitage that day?
Oh, yeah, 7 ships.
7 ships, so it was awful. It was really bad. It's, St. Petersburg, another thing I didn't realize, is built on 42 islands. And so you have canals connecting. It's built on the delta of the Neva River. But there are 3 rivers in St. Petersburg and numerous canals. And you have the boats that take you, it's sort of like Venice of the North. And you can, that's the most fabulous way to see all the buildings, because you're going all the way through the city, and these buildings are on both sides. Former palaces, most of them, just absolutely astounding. They really are. We spent 4 days in St. Petersburg, and while we were there, we took a trip to Pushkin, which is named after the famous Russian poet. And we saw Catherine's palace. That was Catherine the Great. And that, again, Carol has books here. That's the palace that has the amber room.
Yeah.
And you know, during World War II, the Germans totally stripped the amber panels, which had been a gift from Frederick of Prussia to one of the Tsars. Magnificent amber panels, but they've now reconstructed them, and that whole room is amber. It is just, they would not allow us to take photographs in the amber room. We could take them elsewhere, but not in there. But that is definitely a sight to behold. Magnificent palace. We arrived there and the Oompa band was playing Russian songs, and it was really lovely.
Oh, and the man that played the balalaika was unbelievable. Pat went to bed early a few times, and I went to listen to him, but he was unbelievable.
The balalaika
She
is
just got sleepy.
like a Russian. What
This
would you-
is the amber
What's the
room.
closest we have?
String.
It's a string, yeah. 3 strings.
There is no possible way that a picture can do justice to this. No
That's
possible
amber.
way. It's all amber and jewels and gold. And these windows, that's where we stood. We stood there. Can you believe that? That we actually were in front of those windows. And we looked around and we saw, and these books are, you know, you can look at them. And there's a whole book on nothing but the amber room. So, I mean, it's just more than we can possibly talk about, really.
Photographs and words can't do it justice.
No.
They really can. There's no way to describe it.
No, that's
It was really something to behold.
Yeah. That's it.
We also were lucky enough to be able to go to the ballet while we were in St. Petersburg. We saw Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake.
What seat
And
did
we
you
had
sit
front
in?
row seats. Front row seats of the ballet. And that was a nice experience too.
How much that cost?
Pardon?
How much that cost?
It was free.
It was free, it was included. The trip we took, all the excursions were included except a couple. We went to the circus in Moscow, the old Moscow circus, and we had to pay extra for that.
Well worth it.
And I think the trip to Catherine's Palace was included, wasn't it? Yeah, I think we only paid for that one extra. Everything was included in, as well as all you could drink, you know, all the beer and wine. And then we had a wonderful Russian night with vodkas. One of the villages we went to, and there's photographs of it, they had a vodka shop. And I have never seen so much vodka in my life. Thousands of bottles of
Types of
vodka.
vodka.
Yeah,
Different types of vodka.
they had it, it's like a, what did they call that Russian gun? The Kalashnikov, yeah, but it was filled with vodka. They had bottles that looked like Stalin, they had bottles that looked like Lenin, they had all kinds of things. Crowns, because the crowns that they used to crown the Tsars were magnificent. Anyway, they had bottles that were replicas of these crowns.
And then they had the stills. Remember the stills?
Yeah.
I mean, type after type after type of stills where you could make your own vodka.
So, so we went to Catherine's Palace, we went to Peterhof, to the gardens, where the fountains, I've never seen so many fountains in my life, magnificent, beautiful statues, fabulous fountains.
Gardens.
And that is up on the Gulf of Finland. And so really, we were almost in Finland when we were up in Peterhof. And when you could stand there, you're right on the Gulf of Finland, and you can look back across the Gulf and you can see St. Petersburg in the distance with all the high buildings.
Can you tell them about Peter the Great's house?
I've got photos of it.
Have you tell them about
He
that? That
was-
is so cool.
He didn't like large. He was a very, very large man. And I have a photo of him in there from a statue. He was enormous. I think he was almost close to 7 feet tall, but he had a tiny little head. Massive body, a tiny little head, and he did not like large places. So he had this small, we're at these beautiful gardens with this beautiful pavilion and stuff, and he's got this little bitty house
Outside Catherine's palace.
that he lived in, that he liked. Peter the Great. Yeah, yeah. He had a, I don't know what it was, but he didn't like large, he liked small. And even back in Moscow, in the parks, they had a small house that he had enjoyed going to, rather than the large palace.
It's interesting since he was such a large man.
I know, he was so huge, you'd think he'd have wanted something large, you know?
It had nothing to do with his wife, because he was totally in love with his wife. It was just, it was so funny.
He just liked small. So, that's pretty much
Well, how long were y'all gone, Carol?
2 weeks. 2 weeks. 4 days in Moscow, 4 days in St. Petersburg, and then the rest of the time we were wandering up through the Volga River and across lakes. Lake Lagoda is outside of St. Petersburg. Sorry about that. And huge lake, one of the biggest man-made lakes in the world. And that, during that siege of Leningrad in World War II, that was the only way they could get supplies into Leningrad, was to come in across the lake. During that siege, 1 million Russians died, either from starvation or from the shelling of the city. But they never surrendered. So, and to me, it's just amazing. Catherine's palace was bombed out, shelled to almost nothing. And you should see the restoration is just amazing. I think these people must have special training to be able to restore something to how it looked back in the day. Sort of reminded us of Cuba. When we were in Cuba, they were training people, they were opening colleges to train people in restoration because of all the old colonial buildings in Cuba that had rotted away and needed to be restored. And I guess you can't just bring in a regular builder to do these things. You need someone that specializes in restoration work. My only disappointment about the whole trip, I didn't see Omar Sharif. But I did have a lovely wine with.
And we saw Igor.
We did have Igor.
Yeah. And could we hold for the questions until I finish?
Yeah. Yes.
Actually, I believe Omar Sharif was Egyptian.
Yeah.
He was
But he just
actually-
played Dr. Zhivago.
and
He played a
was so
wonderful Dr.
good
Zhivago.
looking, and unfortunately, he developed Alzheimer's. And all the bridge players need to know Omar Sharif was a world champion bridge player.
Oh, was
And I
he?
had thought, this is wonderful, since I'm a bridge player, I'm not going to get Alzheimer's, and he got Alzheimer's.
And he died, what, a couple of years ago?
Not very long ago.
Yeah. But yeah, I want to go back to St. Petersburg. I don't know if I'd go back to Moscow, but I would like to go back to St. Petersburg when it wasn't tourist season, maybe in probably September, after the cruise ship stopped, and see more of it, because it was just, there's no words to describe it. It was magnificent.
Well, you mentioned all the little villages along the river.
I was going to talk.
Did you stop at any of
Carol's
those or
going to
just?
talk about those.
See, if you'll hold your questions for a minute, I might be able to answer, because we have 2 parts to this. Unless you just want to finish.
No, you put too much work into it. No. Thank you. Thank you.
But she asked a question.
I'll be happy to get up and do work. If anybody wants to go.
Yeah. After we're done, if you want to, after I'm done, if you want to ask Pat questions or me questions, we're happy to answer them. We really are. And when she decided she wanted to go to Russia, I was extremely happy to accommodate her and float down up the Volga with her. And
But you might have
Use
asked
the
them,
mic,
or
please.
your voice is much softer. They might not be able to hear you, you may need to use the mic.
okay. Can you hear me?
Well, we can
No.
hear you, but we don't know what
You
you're
can pull it
saying.
out of there to hold it if you want to.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Get it closer.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Well, as I said, I was very, very happy to go with Pat. She needed a partner, and I was happy to go with her. And something happened on the plane that I thought was very interesting. On the way from Frankfurt to Moscow, Pat and I got separated, and I sat next to a young Russian man. His name was Dmitri. And we got to talking, and like all Americans should, I started asking questions about his family. He told me he worked for Lufthansa, and he was going home to Moscow to his baby girl and his wife. And he told me that they lived in an apartment building. And so I started asking him, well, when your baby's a little older, is your wife going to go back to work? And he said to me that in Russia, you have a 3-year maternity leave, and your employer has to keep your job for 3 years. That's something to envy, I think. And then he went on to say, and I learned so much from him, I wanted to share it with you. Then he went on to say that if they had a second child, the government would pay him over $9,000, him and his wife, over $9,000, which was also, I thought, very interesting. He said that the birth rate, because of all the hardships that they'd had over the last 30 years, he said the hardships had made it difficult for people to have big families, so the government had to step in and give a stipend. Then I asked him what happened if they had a third child. He said, well, they gave him land, but I'm not quite sure where that land was going to be, Siberia or somebody, someplace. And then, nosy me, I asked him if he and his wife hoped someday to get an apartment, leave the apartment living and live in a small house somewhere, because we had seen small houses all along the river. He said no, that they wanted to stay in the apartments in Moscow. He said that the transportation was great, the parks were great, the schools were great, the opportunities were great, and that they had no desire to leave apartment living in Moscow, but they did want to have a small home somewhere near the water for weekends, so that they could go on weekends, but they had no desire to live outside the city. And when I finally got off the plane and got on the bus, and Pat will attest to this, the bus ride was so long. The bus ride from the plane to the boat, the first thing we saw was nothing but apartment buildings. I mean apartment buildings, huge high-rise. I counted the stories, and I counted a couple that were at least 20 stories high. Very, very high apartment buildings. Some of them were old, some of them were new, some of them were just 2 or 3 stories. Mostly, though, they were those big, huge ones. And cut in, when you can remember something that I'm not remembering. But interestingly, they had a lot of air conditioners. And every place that there was an apartment, they had a balcony. And a lot of the people had closed in their balconies, but not everybody. But those apartments were, I wished we could have seen inside those apartments so much. The one thing that I was surprised about was about every 4 blocks or so, there was this beautiful little park with several statues. Each one had a statue in it. And as Pat said, there were men out walking their babies, playing with their little boys, women and men walking together, families playing in these parks. They really take advantage of those parks. And I read somewhere that that about 20% of the area of Moscow, and they have 10 million or 20 million, a lot of people there, but about 30% of the area is in parks. So it's really it's an austere city, but it's also quite lovely. And then, of course, there are the old office buildings and old palaces that they built, or very expensive homes that they built that were very ornate and very beautiful. And since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've started painting them different. They used to be very gray, but now people are painting them pink and green and blue. It's quite pretty, especially St. Petersburg. That's where the beauty was. We did not have the opportunity to go inside an apartment. The 2 things that I heard, and only 2 things that I heard Russian people talk about and complain about, was number 1, they didn't make enough money. Well,